Hello everyone. I hope I'm going live now. Sorry, I had a problem with my computer. I had to restart it. But I'm connected now, I believe. So if you're there, please let me know that you're watching this class. It's great to have you there. But it's even better when I know that you are there. So just quick hi would suffice, so I know that everything is going okay. Otherwise, I have no way to know much about this. Let's see. Okay, Yerach, you're there. David's turn. Yeah, okay, whew. Thank goodness. So we are going to study today's Parsha. It's a very interesting why. This week's Parsha. They are two together. You know, this is the thing. We have the Torah is divided into 54 portions, what's called Parshiot. Bonnie Chan said, Bechukotai was Gary's bar mitzvah Parsha. Very nice. Let's put it like this. Yeah. So now everybody can see Bonnie's comments. I can embed it there. That's very nice. So Rocky Pollock's there. So yeah, let me repeat what I said. The Torah is divided into 54 portions that we call Parshiot. Actually, it's interesting because there were two traditions on how to split the Torah and how to read the Torah. One tradition was the tradition from Babylonia, and the other one from the tradition from Israel. The tradition from Israel was to finish the Torah once every 3 years. So they will have shorter portions every week. And it will continue with that, and the cycle would finish every 3 years. So they will celebrate Simchat Torah every 3 years, basically. And in Babylonia, they liked to finish the cycle every year. So basically, we are not following the tradition of Israel, but we are following the tradition of Babylonia, and we have Simchat Torah every year. Hi, Judy. Hold on. My son is here. Yes, Renan? You're done? Yeah. I'll be right there.
What can I have?
Get some game, and I will go.
Annie, I'm watching YouTube. What can I get? What can I get, Annie?
And give me 1 minute, guy. I have a son issue here. 1 minute, I'll be right back. And I'm back. Hola, Javier. So, going back 54 portions in Babylonia, that's what we do. And so, why 54? Because that's the maximum number of Shabbatot that you can have in a leap year whenever we add this second month, the month of Adar 2. So whenever the year is shorter, we have 53, 52, 51 weeks. So there are certain parshiot that we put together, and we have to combine them so we can finish in a year. So this parshiot, Behar and Bechukotai, that they are the last two parshiot of the book of Leviticus. This year we read them together because it's a shorter year. Now, let's jump into the class. We are going to focus today on one simple verse of the Parsha Bechukotai, which is the second one. And it's a concept that I like very much. And we are going to talk about a very interesting concept, which is a concept of different kind of commandments. So let me show you. Let's see if this works. Here you go. This is the verse that we are going to be studying today. And it says on Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3, Im Bechukotai teilechu, vet mitzvotai tishmoru, ve'asitem otam. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments. Okay, I don't know if you can notice already where this is going, because what you have there are two different descriptions of God's will. Because the verse could have easily said, if you follow my laws. But no, it says laws and commandments, which actually, it's interesting the choice of translation that we read there. It could be the other way around. Could be my commandments and observe my laws. Doesn't really matter. Because in Hebrew, every word is very specific. So we are going to dip down into those concepts in a minute. Debbie Pollock says, oh, you read this portion last year. Very nice. Very nice. And let's see who else is connected, by the way. Terry from New York is there. Terry Kushner, Debbie Pollock. Okay. So we're going to study the difference between these two concepts, hukot, and in this case it's at mitzvot, but we are going to see what I'm talking about. Let me go to the next slide. We have two concepts that the rabbis are talking about. Actually, there are three, but for practical terms, we are going to focus into two. Hukim and mishpatim. They are two different kind of mitzvot, but from our perspective. Number one, we have the hukim, that they are actually the word is mentioned in the parsha. That's why I call Bechukotai, same root, right? Bechukotai means my hukim. And the rabbis explain that hukim are those laws in the Torah we seemingly do not know the reason for, such as the prohibition to wear shatnez or forbidden mixtures. For example, that's something very interesting, that we are not allowed to wear wool and linen in the same garment. And you will say, well, who will wear wool and linen in the same garment? It's more common that you think, that you imagine. One of the things that I was explaining, for example, let's say that you have a linen jacket. Chances are that the thread to put the button together in the garment could be made out of wool. So you are having wool and linen in the same garment without even noticing it. So that's one of the ways that we can have that. So, and that is called shatnez. It's a forbidden mixture. We don't supposed to do it, right? Why? We don't know. We don't know. So you see, that have no logic whatsoever, the prohibition of wool and linen. The other thing is the prohibition of eating pork. Well, some people say it's because of the illnesses that pork made, but yet, you know what? I grew up listening to that explanation, but then I was taught that every animal out there, even the kosher animals, we have different illnesses that they can get, can have parasites. Specifically the chicken. Chickens are okay, but you know how many illnesses you can get through a chicken, and they're kosher? So there is no logical reason of all the laws of kashrut. That is not logical. And I believe that trying to explain kashrut using reasoning is going to fail from the get-go. It's not going to go anywhere. And that's why those are difficult mitzvot to fulfill, because they don't make sense to us. And the trend in these days is we don't do anything that we don't understand. And I'm not just talking about Judaism, everything in general. We don't understand it, we don't like it, we don't do it. So this is the same. And the rabbi said some of the mitzvot that they call the hukim fall into that category. We don't understand them, but we have to do it anyway because they are God's will. But there is another category that is called the mishpatim, or the laws for which we know the reason. They make sense. For example, the prohibition of stealing and taking bribes. These are laws that any normal, decent society will enact, and in fact, does enact, right? It's we all know stuff like that the Torah said that we should do, and yeah, we do it because it makes sense. But the funny thing is that those things from the Torah that make sense, and we do it because they make sense, you don't really need the Torah to do that, because chances are that if you live in a civilized society, those laws are part of the civil law anyway. So in other words, the only thing that is exclusively Jewish are the hukim, the ones that we don't understand, the ones that are there only because they are coming from the divine. And that's why they don't make much sense for us. It doesn't mean that we cannot try to understand it. It means that they are not logical when you read them. Okay? There is a difference of that. Hi, Janice. Terry Kushner says something very interesting. I'm going to post it here so everybody can see. Penny Aronovitz, of blessed memory, had a son, also blessed memory, whose job was being a shatnez inspector. Yeah, there is such thing, a shatnez inspector. And the first time I saw that was in one of my trips to New York. I went to a Judaica, and there was a poster there that they were advertising. There was a shatnez lab, whatever that means, that you can take there your garments, and they will tell you if there is any forbidden mixture in the fabric or anything. Yeah, you are correct, Terry. You're absolutely correct. The other thing that they were advertising, and that was interesting, and this is another of the hukim, things that we don't understand. According to the Torah, we are not allowed to shave our faces with a razor. Who knew that? Who knew that you're not allowed to shave your face with a razor? So then how can you shave if you are not allowed to use a razor? Well, the rabbi said that you can use an electric shaver, because the action of the electric shaver is like scissors. It's something that there are two blades that they have friction to each other, and they cut whatever is in between, and that is not a razor, that's a scissors, and scissors are okay. But there is a controversy with one new technology of this electric razor that I believe is called lift and cut, that it will make it more like a razor than a scissors. So there was also a lab in New York City. What they do is they remove that from the head of the shaver. So it goes back to the older technology, where it's still out of how you call it? It's still more like scissors and not like razor. Okay, yeah. So we have many things that they fall into hukim, and the other one at mishpatim. And there is another category, I didn't even put it there. It's called the edot. Edot means testimonials, which are basically the holidays. That they don't really make sense, but because we have it there to celebrate something that happened, so we understand it. So that will be the third category that technically we have. Okay, now let's put together the hukim and the mishpatim, so you understand that there are two different categories within the Torah. But what you have to understand is that the source of the law in Judaism is not just the Torah that we read in synagogue. Okay, we have that whatever law is coming from the written Torah is called deoraita, which is Aramaic for from the Torah. Okay, Terry Kushner said, going back to the other thing, what you said, Terry, it said, what about laser hair removal? Yeah, laser hair is okay, and also it's okay waxing, just so you know. And I will leave it there. Let's keep moving. So again, everything that we learn from the Torah directly, it means that there is a verse in the Torah saying something, and then we observe, we do that because it's written in that verse. That is called deoraita. But there is another source of law that is called the Rabbanan. from the rabbis. And there are all these laws that the rabbis basically added. Because in Judaism, we believe that there is a written law, that is the Torah, and an oral law that it was given from God directly to Moses orally. And then Moses continued that oral tradition, teaching all that information to Joshua, who came after him. And then Joshua taught all that information to the elders to the prophets, and so forth. And that kept going from one generation to another as a parallel source of law. We have the written law and the oral law that it was also passing from generation to generation. And it was always, according to the rabbis, there was always a group of people that dedicated their lives to learn and transmit this oral law. So, yeah, in the Torah we have Hukim and Mishpatim, and that's what we read in this week's Parsha. It's all good. But we also have to understand, and this is what I would like to expand more in this class, is that we also have the other source of law that comes from the rabbi, and there is a third source of law that we are going to also explore today, that is minhag, which is the tradition. And we all, I'm pretty sure we all had experiences with this kind of law. You got different places and they do things differently. How is that possible? Well, because that's the tradition of the place, what we call the minhag makom, and something that is being kept from many generations, it becomes a new law and it cannot be changed. Perfect example is the kippah. The kippah is not in the Torah, it's not in the Talmud, it's part of the minhag. It's a tradition. Okay? Debbie asked, until the Shulchan Aruch, no, it's beyond Shulchan Aruch. The halakha keeps evolving in every generation. There are always new cases, and we reinterpret halakha. Of course, we take into consideration precedents, but it's one way or another, it's always evolving. Okay, so let's continue. Let's talk a little bit about the written law, which we call Deoraita. And then the Talmud says, Rabbi Simlai expounded, 613 mitzvot were told to Moses. 365 prohibition, corresponding to the days of the solar year, and 248 prescriptions, like the number of limbs in a person. Rabbi Hamnuna said, what verse supports this? And they explain. Moses commanded us Torah, a heritage, and that's from the book of Deuteronomy. Torah has the numerical equivalent in Gematria of 611, while I am the Lord your God, and you shall not have other gods before me, were heard directly from God. Let me explain what is this. First, for those who don't know, Gematria is a way to read the Torah where every letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a number. So let's go. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, that will be the first four letters of the alphabet, will be 1, 2, 3, 4, so forth. Once you reach the Yud, that will be 10, and then the next letter will be 20, 30, 40, etc. The last letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the Taf, that will be 400. So you can actually take every given Hebrew letter, a Hebrew word, and then calculate the numerical value of every letter, and then you put it together, that will give you a number, and sometimes that number is our understanding from the point of view of Kabbalah, or the hidden teachings of Judaism, that is the essence of the word. The word could be understood by meaning, but also for the numerical value. It's almost like every object that we have in this world. The object will have a name. Let's say, for example, an object, water, right? Water is the name, but water also has a numerical value, which is H2O. This is interesting because the rabbis believe that two different words that might seem to be unrelated, if they have the same numerical value, they are connected in the essence of the word. Same happens with objects. Water is H2O, but also ice is H2O, and steam is H2O. They are three different things that unless you understand that the composition, the chemical composition is the same, they might seem to you like different and separate and disconnected. But because of the numerical value, we understand that they are indeed connected. So gematria is very important. That is studied by rabbis, and they connect words and they learn things through the numerical value of different words. So let's go back to this. They understand, the Talmud says that the Torah contains 613 commandments. Funny thing is, the Talmud doesn't say which one are the 613 commandments. So we have many different lists. There is no unanimous list. So it depends which collection of lists you have. It might be a little bit different from one to the other. Okay? So after they came out with this number, 613, which, by the way, it seems that this was taught orally to Moses. This is one of the things from the oral law. God said to Moses, in this Torah that I give you, it's going to be 613 commandments, and that was passed from generation to generation. So Rabbi Simblai say there are 613 commandments. He's repeating what he learned from his teachers. Okay, and that was told to Moses. And they said, and the midrash here, the teaching here, the learning here is 613. Why? Because 365 prohibition corresponding to the days of the solar year, and 248 prescriptions of things that you should do, like the number of limbs in a person. That was the understanding at the time. They understood that every person had 248 limbs. In other words, I don't know if you can see the message here, if you can read between lines. What Rabbi Simblai is saying is that the mitzvot cover everything. In other words, something that covers the entire year. Nothing escapes to the mitzvot, to the commandments, and something that you have to fulfill with your entire body. No part of you can escape to the commandments. Very interesting teaching from this Numbers 613. But the other Rabbi Hamnuna said, how do we learn that? I mean, is there any other source that will take us to the same place? And he said, Moses commanded us Torah as a heritage. So what is the numerical value of Torah? 611. But wait. The number was 613. But out of all the commandments that they were given to the Jewish people, all the commandments that were revealed on Sinai, the rabbis explain that there were two that they were heard by the entire people of Israel. Those were the first two commandments of the 10 commandments. After that, the people of Israel stopped God from talking and said, we cannot handle this intense experience anymore. Moses, please be the intermediary between you and God, so we can between us and God, so we can receive the rest of the Torah. So Torah is 611, plus the two commandments that God was able to communicate directly to the Jewish people. Those were two. So 611 plus 2 takes us to 613. So that was the Talmud is trying to tell us. Here, they present two reasoning why this number 613. But in practical terms, now we know, one list or another, that there is a consensus that there are 613 commandments in the written Torah. And that's what we have to understand. But, as I mentioned before, we also have the oral Torah. So, I'm going to quote here the Rambam, this medieval rabbi, philosopher, physician, and he said the 8th fundamental principle of Judaism, he came out with 13 principles, so maybe that's for another class, but the 8th is that the Torah is from heaven. This means that we must believe that this entire Torah, which was given us from Moses, our teacher, may he rest in peace, is entirely from the mouth of the Almighty. All this is also true for the explanation of the Torah, what we call the oral Torah, which was also received from the mouth of the Almighty. the manner in which we today perform the mitzvah of sukkah, for example, how we build. How do we know that the sukkah had to look like the sukkah that we built in our backyard? How do we know the shape of the lulav? How do we know what is a shofar? How do we know how to tie the knot of the tzitzit? Or how to build the tefillin, right? How do we know? It's not written in the Torah. So it says, another item is precisely the way that God, blessed be He, told Moses, who then informed us. And the one whom God appointed as an agent is surely to be relied upon. So this is the thing. The rabbis noted that there are many things that they were taking, that are given. They are the way they are. They are not in the Torah. Nobody ever contested the way it was done. How can we do it that way? So the explanation that we learn from the Rambam, he said, is because there is an oral law. God gave Moses the Torah, and according to tradition, God was dictating, Moses was writing, right? And every time that Moses wrote something, it's not only that, God also explained to Moses every word of the Torah and how to understand the verses. Because let's be honest, if you read only the written Torah, there are gaps. You won't know how to do what is written in the Torah. It's not clear. There are lots of information that we don't have. And one of the things is the thing for the sukkah, for example. How do we know what an etrog is? You see the yellow thing that we have on Sukkot. Or what it says, the fruit of a beautiful tree. It doesn't say what it is. How do we know how to kill an animal to make it a kosher slaughter? It doesn't say. In fact, the Torah said you have to do it the way I told you, but we never read anywhere. God didn't tell us explicitly how to do it, and the rabbis understand, for example, that that's one reference to such thing of oral law, that there is another body of law that it was orally transmitted to Moses, and that's what we call the oral law. In these days, that became the Talmud. Eventually, the oral law was written down so it wouldn't be lost. So that's what we call the Talmud in this day. So in general terms, written law is the Torah we read in the synagogue. Oral law is the Talmud. And the Talmud, again, is the combination of the Mishnah and the Gemara. That's a very important thing that we have to do it. So another... Let's see, Rocky Pollack said, so is the oral set of law now complete? Well, it was always complete. And it's basically God gave all that information to Moses, and it was completed. That's it. There is no other way. There is a confusion because eventually, according to the rabbis, there was a time where the rabbis, the new generations, were not as disciplined as the generations before, and they started to disagree on certain things, right? In other words, they couldn't remember. They didn't remember the same things. Well, my teacher taught me A, and the other one said, no. My teacher told me B, and he knows more than yours. Yes, no, and they couldn't agree on basic things. And you probably heard these discussions between Hillel and Shammai, which is interesting because according to the Talmud, Hillel and Shammai themselves, the two rabbis, that according to the urban legends, they were always fighting. They didn't fight for anything. They agreed on everything except on two little things. They had only two disagreements. What we understand that they were Hillel and Shammai discussing and not being in agreement are the students of Hillel and Shammai, what we call Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. They didn't pay enough attention of what their teachers taught, so they have all these disagreements. Okay? So eventually, at one point, all the rabbis from Israel, from Babylonia, they got together, they wrote the Talmud, which is a compilation of all the information they had on oral law at that time. And that was written down. So at that point, when the Talmud was written, yes, Rocky, we can say that the set of laws, of oral laws, were completed. That's the way it is. Everything that came after, it does not represent the oral law anymore. It represents our understanding of the oral law as written in the Talmud, which is a difference. It's not that we have more information on the oral law. We have new interpretations of the oral law. But yes, the Torah itself says that there will never be a new set of laws. So we cannot get any information, and that's why we don't learn anything new from prophets, for example. We don't believe that the prophets were sent by God to teach novel things of God's will. The prophets were sent by God just to remind us of what was already revealed in the written Torah and on the oral Torah. That's something that is very important for you guys to understand. That is Judaism, Jewish theology, one-on-one. One of the foundations that we believe that nothing new was revealed to the world after the Torah. With new challenges, is it the law still being written today? Well, what we have today is what is called responsa, but they are all based on precedents already written in the Talmud or in the written Torah. But technically, they are not really new laws. They are new ways to use the law that it was already written and how it applies to new challenges that we have today. So we always connect new challenges with all law in one way or another. We don't believe there is nothing new being revealed in this generation. Okay? And that is something very important. Okay? So let's read a little bit more about this oral law. Here. So, another of the verses the Rabbi used to justify the oral law, right? Because what does it say in the Torah that there is an oral law? Give me a proof. Well, here it is, Leviticus 26:46. Also this parsha. It says, "These are the statutes, the ordinances, and the Torahs," plural, "that the Lord gave between himself and the children of Israel on Mount Sinai through Moses." And then Rashi, of course, this is very juicy. He noticed that the word Torahs, right, is in plural. And he said, why the plural form Torahs? Tricky. This denotes two Torahs, one written Torah and one oral Torah. It teaches us that all was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, not just the written one, but also the other one. So let me go back. I don't want to give you a spoiler. So previous. Let's stay there for a minute. This is very interesting, and we are going to see it in a minute, that the translation of Torahs as two Torahs is stretching the Hebrew a little bit. Because the word Torah means instruction. That's the origin of the word Torah. We read the Torah because it's the instruction of God to us. So technically the verse should read, these are the statutes, the ordinances, and the instructions, plural, right? Because there are many instructions in the book that the Lord gave between himself and the children of Israel on Mount Sinai through Moses. Okay? That will be, to me, the most logical understanding of the verse, but the rabbis, in this case, they decided to take the word Torah literally, I guess, out of convenience, because it's actually a perfect proof that there is such thing as the written law and the oral law, but that's not the only way to understand it. In fact, for some of you who know me, when I became a rabbi, I did my final paper. I did a little research on Karaite Judaism, which is a sect within Judaism that they rejected the Talmud. And they actually, I learned it through them, that they translate this verse, the word Torah, as instructions. So they actually cannot see that verse proving that there is a written law and an oral law. More about Karaites coming in a minute. It's part of the class. let me read a few questions that I have today. When Debbie Stern says, when did the law about not eating chicken and milk were written, since chickens don't produce milk? Excellent question. Is coming in a minute, the answer. It's coming in a minute. Because there is something that is called Gezerah that we have to learn. That so you will understand what I'm talking about in a minute. Hold that thought, because the answer is part of this class. And Debbie Pollock said, at synagogue we read both the Torah and prophets. Is this to include more broad understanding of the law? No, actually, my understanding why we read both the Torah and the Haftorah, that's what you mean, basically, and the Haftorah is part of the prophets, is because the prophets are beautiful in the sense that you can see how Torah was applied in real life. Because during their journey, the 40 years journey of the Israelites in the desert from Egypt to the Promised Land, yes, the Torah was revealed, but there is not much Torah applied to the time, because most of the Torah is to be applied in the land of Israel, and they were not there yet. In fact, the Torah ends with the Israelites in the other side of the Jordan River. They couldn't even enter to the Promised Land. So we never read that in the Torah. We start reading about the settling on the Promised Land and the land of Israel on the prophets. And that's why we bring texts of the prophets at synagogue, so we can understand how Torah applies to real life. Okay? Yeah, Terry, you tried to answer. And Yerach, yeah, hold the thoughts about the thing about chicken and milk, because it's coming in a minute. Okay? So let's continue with more Rambam here. He says, the first section of the wisdom of the oral law contains the explanations received through Moses. They're alluded to in the verses that can be derived from the written words using the traditional method. It is not possible to challenge or refute this teaching. Talking about putting a safeguard for whatever was said before. So according to the Rambam, if we don't like the method the rabbis use to create the Talmud, to put together the oral law, you're out of luck, because you cannot do anything at this point. It's done. So one, it is established that someone has received such tradition all the way back to Moses. All grounds for debate have been dispelled. Take that. It's a very it's hard statement, very harsh statement that Rambam said there. Okay, so basically, the Talmud was written with a specific methodology. It's kind of interesting. It's not easy to understand, but there is a logic and a reasoning, the way it was put together. So in the Talmud, you will find many different things. Some of the things are presented as given directly from God, so there is no connection to the Torah. But there are many of the things presented in the Talmud that are presented in a way that this is coming from this verse, but the interpretation of the verse is coming from God. Okay? And one that is accepted by everybody, because basically the way the Talmud works is the opinions were voted upon, and then if something there is a majority, we follow the majority, and that's what becomes halakha, that's what becomes law. Once that is decided, means that tradition could be traced all the way back to Moses. Once that was voted, and we are not allowed to change it. That's the way it is. If there is no agreement, it's called teiku. There is a how do you call it? But they finish with the same score. Basically, there is a word in English, but I can't remember it. It's a tie. It's a tie. So basically, what means when the Messiah comes, Messiah will let us know who was right. Otherwise, we follow the majority. Let's continue. The other things that you may be familiar of how we learn halakha, and I put this with little words, little fonts, because it doesn't really matter. I'm presenting this to you just so you know that it exists. It's in every Siddur, every prayer book, early in the morning before we say Kaddish the Rabbanan. Chances are that you saw this. The 13 principles of exegesis. In other words, on how we can learn things directly from the Torah. And for example, I will read a couple there. Rabbi Ishmael says, through 13 rules is the Torah elucidated. Number one, through a conclusion inferred from a lenient law to a strict one, also called a fortiori, and vice versa. In Hebrew, this is called kal vachomer, and this is one of the most common ways to understand halakha, to understand what the verse means. So this means, for example, that if you have, let me show you an example of how kal vachomer works. If I say to you that if a bodybuilder cannot lift some specific set of weights, kal vachomer, a 6-year-old boy. In other words, if the bodybuilder cannot lift it, even more so, a little boy. Okay, so that's using logic to understand something from the Torah. So you take a verse and I said this applies here, even more so in this other case. So that's one way to do it. Okay, so through tradition, that similar words in different contexts are meant to clarify one another. This is called what is called gezerah shava. So basically, it means that sometimes you connect two words that they appear in two different parts of the text, because in the first text that you are reading, the meaning of the word is not clear. But the same word appear in another text, and in that text, the meaning of the word is clear. So now that you learn the meaning of the word in that other text, you can come back to your original text and understand the context of where you are trying to learn in that first text. Now, the tricky thing with this one is you can only connect words in the way that it was already authorized by the rabbi. You cannot go and try to make your own connections of words here and there. This rule was already done, and we cannot come out with novel cases. That's not the case with kal vachomer. Kal vachomer would still have a little bit more room to use our reasoning to learn new things, but with this thing, when we connect similar words, we cannot do that anymore. One of the things that we learn through this is, for example, why we need 10 people to form a minyan, because we needed to find a minimum number for the word congregation, right? How do we know how many people constitute a congregation? We don't know. But then the same word was used, for example, in the episode of the 12 spies, when they went to scout the land of Israel. They came back. Remember, 10 of the spies came back with a negative report. 2 of the spies came with a positive report. But the people of Israel decided to believe the 10 with a negative report. God was furious because of that and said, for how much longer I will have to, what was the word to use? Tolerate this evil congregation. It was talking about the 10 spies. So here we have the word congregation connected to 10 people. So can be a congregation of less than 10 people, maybe, but we don't have any precedent in the Torah, but we do have one with the same word related to the number 10. So we can apply the same number 10 in the other one where we read that the name of God could be glorified in the midst of a congregation. So here you go. We connect words. We can go there using logic. So again, 13 principles and ways that we can understand things using our brains to figure things out. But eventually all that became part of the Talmud. Let me give you another example here. It says these words might also be a sign. This is a part of the Shema Israel, what we are talking about, putting the tefillin. It said these words might also be a sign for you on your arm, and a reminder between your eyes, so that God Torah may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand God took you out of Egypt. Book of Exodus. And then the Talmud, Masechet Menachot, page 37b, it says, head tefillin are placed on the high part of the head. How do we learn this? The sages have taught between your eyes. This refers to the high part of the head. You say it refers to the high part of the head, but maybe it really means literally between the eyes, right? Because in Hebrew it's beinei necha, Beinenecha, the literal translation, means between your eyes, so it should be here, like a mask, but we know that we put tefillin in this part of the head. How do we learn that? So the rabbi said, if you say it refers to the high part of the head, but maybe it really means literally between the eyes, the answer is, it says here in Deuteronomy regarding tefillin, between your eyes, and it also says there in Deuteronomy 14:1 regarding the prohibition of self-mutilation. Do not make a bald patch between your eyes as a sign of mourning. Just as there is referring to the high part of the head, where a bald patch can be made, so too here it refers to the high part of the head, where a bald patch could be made. Another example of how we connect words to learn new things, to understand God's will. And this is the case with the tefillin, right? Now there is let's skip this one, because this is the answer to the questions that many of you have been asking about the prohibition of mixing the chicken with the milk. Let's read about this. The fourth category includes the laws enacted of the prophets and sages decreed in every generation as a protective fence. Gezeira is called, a protective fence around the laws of the Torah. For example, to distance people from coming to transgress biblical prohibition. God ordered the sages to institute such measures with a general command. And the command is from the book of Leviticus. It says, and you shall safeguard what I wish to be safeguarded. Tradition teaches that this means institute a safeguard or a fence for those things that I wish to protect. The sages call these decrees gezeirot. Once the sages agree to enact such gezeirah, no one may disobey it under any circumstance. Once the enactment becomes widely accepted among the people of Israel, it is impossible to repeal the gezeirah. Even prophets are powerless to nullify such an enactment. So basically what happened is the prohibition, and I will put this at Yerach said before, because it's it said, it is prohibited to eat chicken and milk because you might confuse red meat for chicken. Yeah, that's correct. The rabbis noticed that. So what they did is, just to avoid any kind of problems, they built a fence around the law of not mixing meat with milk. Because if you go back to the Torah, it just says you should not boil or cook the kid in its mother's milk. That's all what it says. But from there, the rabbis started to build fences to make it virtually impossible to break that original commandment that we read from the Torah. So it's not just that we don't mix or we don't cook together the kid in its mother's milk, but we also don't cook together any kind of meat and milk. Is that clear? So what we are doing here is to make the commandment super stringent, so there are no chances whatsoever that we are going to break that important commandment. That's why, for example, we start Shabbat 18 minutes before the time of Shabbat. So by any reason your watch, your clock was a little bit off, you're still not violating the Shabbat because you get some buffer in between. So there are many things that we observe that we don't realize, that they are there not because they were commanded in the Torah that way, but because the rabbis made it a little bit more stringent, so there is no way that we can violate the original commandment as written on the Torah. Now, Terry said something very important. He said, why can't you eat meat and fish from the same plate? And that has nothing to do with the Gezeira. That has to do with bad chemistry knowledge of the rabbis, that they thought that it was something dangerous. And because it was continued for many generations, even though we know that that makes no sense, we still do it. So nothing to do with the Gezeira. Okay, so let's continue here. And these are the last two that we'll learn from the rabbis. Another category includes laws instituted by the sages upon discovering that they will be beneficial for the Jewish people. Did include civil practices regarding people's interrelationships. These are unconnected to mitzvah observance and do not add to or subtract from the Torah's mitzvot. Yeah, because there is another law in the Torah that it said that we are not allowed to add or subtract from the mitzvot. So how can you justify that the rabbi seems to be perceived as adding things to the law? Well, they're not really adding. They are actually making it more difficult to break a commandment. So it's not considered as added. Or you are actually regulating new things to make the Torah observance better, more efficient. So you are not technically adding or subtracting. And B, rules that improve the observance and fulfillment of the mitzvot. These rules are called minhagim, customs or traditions, and takanot, institutions or corrections. It is forbidden to transgress them once they have been universally ratified by the nations. Let me give you a couple of examples. One of the takanot, the corrections, the most famous one is the fact that we are not allowed to marry many wives. The Torah says that you can marry many women, right? But then around 1,000 years ago, it was changed and said that no, we have to be monogamous. We can marry only one person. Same thing, the Torah says if you don't like your wife, you just write her a get, a bill of divorce, and you send her away. And the rabbis, again, about 1,000 years ago, they wrote a takana, a correction, said no, you're not allowed to do that. She has to accept the get. You can't just kick her out of your house. So these are things that they were added to improve the observance and fulfillment of the mitzvot. It's a shame that they didn't go any further to say that the woman can initiate the divorce as well. That states the way it was, that only men can initiate the divorce. And the other thing are the minhagim, the traditions that we all do because they were always done that way. Rocky, what are you saying? Let me see. So minhagim were sort of arbitrary when written. They were never written, actually. People started to do it and then they continued doing it. Sometimes we don't even know why they started to do it. That's the truth. Okay? Rob Trachtenberg. Yeah, okay. Another bar mitzvah for this parsha. And Rocky, you said no foundation in any Torah. I don't understand what you're trying to say there. If you can expand a little bit, that would be great. So this is the way we understand. When we say we, I mean rabbinic Jews. Okay, because as I mentioned before, Judaism splits into two groups. One is what we call mainstream and is rabbinic Judaism, and the other one is what I mentioned before, the Karaite way of Judaism, that they exist. They live in Israel, they are considered Jews, but they rejected the Talmud as a source of law, right? And I will go quickly through this. What are Karaites? The group is called Karaites, of children or disciples of the scripture. In Hebrew, we call it Bnei Mikra. Mikra is one of the words of scripture. So Karaites means the one who follow the Mikra, the scripture only, the Torah only, because their faith is based on the written scripture, Mikra. The first reference to more than one stream of Judaism took place approximately 200 years after the end of the biblical period, the 1st century BCE. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were two opposing movements. I don't know if you ever heard about that. The Sadducees, a priestly class followers of the priest Tzadok, or Sadok, that's what they call Sadducees, or Tzdukim in Hebrew, were opposed the Pharisees, later known as the rabbis. Okay? So the Sadducees follow only the written Torah, while the Pharisees believe in a second oral Torah, which they added to the written one. Historically, the Karaites started to be visible 2 centuries after the completion of the Talmud. So the theory here is that there was always within Judaism two groups, one that accepted the oral law and the one that didn't accept the oral law, but they coexisted. until around 200 years after the Talmud was done. And then there was the famous Rabbi Sadia Gaon that he pretty much kicked out of Judaism all the Karaites because the disagreements became more noticeable. The most important disagreement they had was about the beginning of the new month, which you know that Jews, we have now, or Rabbinic Jews, we use a mathematical calendar, while the Karaites refused to abandon the calendar based on the spotting of the new moon. That was so basically, you should know that even though we have a mathematical calendar, the beginning of the month is not necessarily the new moon. So they started to celebrate holidays sometimes with 1, 2, or 3 days of difference between one to the other. And Sadia Gaon said, you have to accept this. They said, no, yes, no, okay, you're out. And because Rabbinic Judaism was the majority, was the mainstream one, they would easily got them out. Okay, let's see other comment. Murray, you said, we make accommodation for things the rabbis could not have foreseen. Example, we no longer consider it a violation to use our cars on Shabbat. Well, we are going to see that in a minute because that is something that was brought by conservative Judaism. Okay? Yeah. So let's continue with this. So I wanted to present who the Karaites are, and this is the way they this is what happened. Although they accuse each other of distorting the will of God, Rabbanites, that's the way they called us, by the way. We called them Karaites, they called us Rabbanites. They coexisted, interacted, and learned from each other until the 10th century, when under the initiative of Sadia Gaon, that's what I mentioned, the head of the Babylonian community, rabbis began to systematically attack Karaite practice and theology. This new approach put an end, at least officially, to the acceptance of Karaism as a valid form of Judaism. But by the way, they are accepted by the state of Israel and many rabbis as valid Jews. The Karaites, it's a very small group because they banned conversions for about 500 years, and now they started again. So they started to grow little by little. And the problem is there are not too many places in the world where they can live, because their understanding of the Torah is that you cannot have any kind of fire on Shabbat, even if it's pre-existent. You know, we can have pre-existent fire on Shabbat. So we can have a furnace running during Shabbat, so we can have heat in the winter month, but they don't. So forget about finding a Karaite in Winnipeg. They wouldn't survive here because they have the obligation to stop the furnace before Shabbat, and they will turn it back on at the end of Shabbat. So they can't live everywhere in the world they want. It's very interesting. So how can somebody without the Talmud know what to do? For us, it's very easy. It's in the Talmud, so we have something filling up the gaps that we find in the Torah. So how could it be another way to understand the Torah that does not involve the oral law? So the Karaites understand, and because they have 3 components. To know what God wants, they have the written text of the Tanakh. It's what we call the Oraita. Some things are clear from the Torah, right? The Torah is regarded as perfect and complete on the basis of the following passage. In order they obey the mitzvot of Adonai your God, which I'm giving you, do not add to what I'm saying, and do not subtract from it. So they believe that the oral law is a violation to this verse from Deuteronomy. They believe that the rabbis added to the Torah, so that is a big no-no. How can you violate something that is so clearly written in the Torah? Interesting. Second way, and this is very interesting, they use something called hekesh, or analogy. For example, the Bible forbids marriages between a man and his mother or father's sister. So by analogy, a woman is forbidden to marry her father's brother or mother's brother. So it's very interesting, a very simple way of understanding what God wants from us. They only use logic to understand the Torah. The problem with hekesh is very relative. It's very relative. because there are many different ways to understand this analogy. So you can make a different kind of analogy. So I don't know how they survived for so long with kind of some sort of unified understanding of many basic principles, but they did. They did. There are many things that they agree, even though they could have gone to totally different ways, because that's all they use. They don't have the 13 principles of Rabbi Ishmael. They have one principle, Hekesh, analogy, and they can figure out God's will, according to their understanding, only with that. And the third thing they have is Sevel HaYerusha, burden of inheritance, which is pretty much what we call minhag, the tradition. They also have that. For example, in Egypt, the Karaites who lived in Egypt, by the way, they were all expelled from Egypt during the Sinai War, and they all moved in mass to Israel, and that's where they live now. So most of Karaites are from Egypt. The other big group of Karaites are from Russia. They live in the Crimea, Russia, Ukraine, the Crimea area. So in Egypt, bar mitzvahs were not held for boys coming of age, but in Israel, once they moved to Israel, Karaites frequently hold bar mitzvahs because of pressure to conform, and the practice may become integrated into their Sevel HaYerusha. So what happened is, when Karaites were coexisting in communities where Rabbinites were living as well, they started to take some of their traditions. They liked it. They don't do it because they believe the Torah said so. They do it because they liked what they see, and they adopt it as a tradition. Once they adopted it, it becomes their Sevel HaYerusha, or their minhag, their new tradition, and they also cannot change it anymore. Okay, but it's something I wanted to share with you, this so you know that it exists, Karaite Judaism, and it's very interesting. And going back to riding a car on Shabbat, we have to understand conservative Judaism. There is and its unique way to understand halakha, to understand the mitzvot. So conservative Judaism views of halakha, Jewish laws, views halakha as normative and binding. Okay, that sense, we are the same of Orthodox Judaism. We believe that whatever we understand is halakha, is law, is the will of God. Whatever we understand, that we have to do it because it comes from God. Okay. The conservative movement applies Jewish law to the full range of Jewish belief and practice, including thrice daily prayer, so we have to pray 3 times a day, Shabbat and holidays, marital relations, and family purity, conversions, kashrut, Jewish medical ethics, etc. Okay? So far, so good. Institutionally, the conservative movement's rules on Jewish law, both through centralized decisions, primarily by the Rabbinical Assembly and its Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, and through congregational rabbis at a local level. So in other words, yeah, we follow halakha, but not as presented to us by the Shulchan Aruch or by the Talmud. We accept halakha as presented to us by the Rabbinical Assembly through the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. So it's almost like they vote and everything every time. And they make their own decision of what constitutes halakha, the way we have to do it. But at the same time, so for certain things, local rabbis have the room to decide how to apply the law. Because as they vote these things, there is always a majority opinion and minority opinion, and the local rabbi sometimes might decide to follow a minority opinion, and that's okay. And let that something, I'm not exactly sure how it works, but the conservative movement can also produce something called the takana. There's something that is universally accepted, and then in those specific things, even local rabbis are obligated to follow that that opinion. Okay, and then of course, Reform Judaism is different because Reform halakha is not binding. It's not binding, so that's why we have the joke, right? I say, how many Orthodox Jews you need to change a light bulb? And the answer is none, because they don't believe in change. How many conservative rabbis you need to change a light bulb? And the answer is we don't know, because they are still talking about it. And then how many Reform rabbis you need to change a light bulb? And the answer is also none, because everybody changes things whatever they want. That is different. It's difficult to take a joke through a computer because I cannot see your faces. But anyway, so I hope you understood the point, that you understood what I tried to teach today. And if you have any questions, let's take a couple of minutes, and then we can all continue with our days. And thank you all for being there. Thank you for connecting, and thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe to our channels, and yeah. Remember, we have services twice a day at Shaarei Zedek, 7:30 in the morning and 6 p.m., except for Friday that we have the afternoon at 5:30, and on Saturday that the morning is 10 a.m. So you can visit our website, www.szwinnipeg.ca. We also have a YouTube channel, Facebook page. You can subscribe, and you can receive updates and notification every time we go live. Okay, so thank you for being there. Next week, next Thursday, same time, same channel. Stay safe. Bye for now.